Okay, welcome to a new episode, folks. Daniel is back again with Lisa Mckenzie coming at us from the UK, where she has made a name for herself as a working class academic and has really done some incredible research. And I was just reading Lisa your articles, reading some of your essays, watching some of your interventions on popular television programs. And I must say, I was very impressed. I saw a few years ago you had a debate at Oxford, and it's nice to see someone with a fidelity to the working class question, the working class experience within academia, but also, Lisa, I think you do a lot of political activism outside of academia. One of the things I wanted to chat with you about today as a general topic is sort of some of the impediments of this bringing together working class and academic. One of the first impediments, in my estimation, would be, does academia depoliticize class, right? Or put another way, does academia liberalize an idea of the working class, right? That to me is a question, right? I think that it does do that, no doubt. Lisa's involved with, and you can tell us about this. I'd actually like to have you just open telling us a little bit about your research and in general, but you're involved with working class studies, and that's actually an American centered effort, which is interesting because the Americans, speaking as an American, have a very tough time with understanding class, at least as I see it. So let us begin by just getting a sense of you know, not so much your bio, but like the kind of research that you do and what your sort of objectives are in studying the working class.
Gosh, well, I accidentally sort of became an academic. I think I don't know. I think it's quite kind of a thing that most academics do. Actually, they sort of accidentally become an academic. But I definitely did, because I didn't know what an academic was. I didn't even know what universities were, to be honest. I left school at 16, no qualifications, and I worked in a factory called Pretty Polly making tights. And I did that for 11 years. My dad was a coal miner. My mum was a factory worker. I was a factory worker. I've always lived on what in the UK we call council estates, which is public housing, so obviously going to university was never anything in my scope, understanding. It was just not there. But I did go, but I obviously didn't go as an 18-year-old like most students. I went as a 31-year-old, as a mother, still a working class woman, and still living on a council estate. So when I got to university, it was a surprise to me because I didn't know what I was doing there. I went because I was at what you might call a community college.
Right.
So I'd gone back to study in a community college as an adult, and I came across sociology. And I'd not really known much about it, but I started to really like the questions that were being asked. And then somebody from the University of Nottingham, where I live and where I'd gone to university, they came and did a talk to us adults who were at a community college, and they were telling us about this study that had been done in a place in Nottingham called St. Anne's. Now, I lived in St. Anne's, and the study was called Poverty, the Forgotten Englishman. And it was published in 1965, I think. And so these sort of academics who were talking about this study, I was sat there as a 31-year-old mother living on that council estate, living in that area, thinking, I didn't know you could go to university and do this. I didn't know that a place where I lived would be important or interesting. And it just caught me. It captured me. So I decided to go to the University of Nottingham and to study sociology, but also I got this thing in my head that I wanted to do research and a study about St Anne's, where I lived. And almost 10 years after that initial thought, you know, I handed in a PhD and I'd done research in the community where I lived. And so my research, my understanding of class, my understanding of what stories get told and how and why, as absolutely all of it come from my own personal sort of ideas, personal experiences, but also politics as well. Because, you know, if you are a researcher and you are or an academic of class, you know, you should really have some sort of politics, and you should understand the politics around that.
What is most researchers and academics that study class, what do you think draws them to it? By and large.
Well, traditionally,
Is it because their origins tend to be working class? Is that the idea?
No, not at all. Actually, I mean, I think you've got sort of Richard Hoggart, who was one of the sort of first working class academics, and he wrote all about, you know, he wrote a lot about working class people. But I think traditionally in sociology, class in Britain, it's always been really about the economy. It's been about inequality. And so obviously sociologists and academics are interested in that. And so I think what brought academics to studying class, it was probably, you know, they wanted to know more about inequality wherever they lived. There are very few actual working class academics, actually. Very, you know, there are not many of us. And then those of us that are working class, I think, you know, we do to get drawn into the subject because it's existential for us. It's not just study, it's sort of existential.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. I think we'll come back to some of these biographical questions and personal questions, but I want to pivot briefly to a question about definition and meaning of class as an analytic category. And sort of, I think there has been a sense in which if you're not an academic or if you don't study these economic, sociological, or philosophical understandings of class, you still walk around with an intuitive idea that class power exists, and you see this, but you don't have the kind of language to articulate it, to name it, so it usually becomes translated into something else.
Yes.
And you can kind of see, because for me, to put my cards on the table, I think in capitalist society, from a Marxist point of view primarily, okay, but even there, I think Marx has a lot of blind spots when it comes to understanding contemporary class issues. But one thing I think that the Marxist tradition does right is that you see this idea that class antagonisms create a collapse in our understanding of social reality. That we lack the capacity to name class antagonisms, and that politics should be steered towards greater fluency and articulation of those. So I've always thought that, and you could call this a kind of intellectual enterprise of Marxism, perhaps, or even of the left or of socialism, if you like, to sort of give people the literacy to actually be able to identify class antagonisms, because otherwise capitalism does an ingenious job of covering them over, right?
Yeah.
And I want to start by asking you, how do you understand class antagonisms, and sort of what are some useful frameworks and definitions that you work with? If you could speak broadly to that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, and I, you know, and I absolutely agree with you actually that capitalism, you know, its greatest trick is to sort of I mean, Bourdieu, Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, one of the things that he talks about is sort of, the magician that just sort of pulls the rabbit out the hat. And, we don't know where it's come from, but it's actually a trick. And actually, that's what capitalism does. It fools us into believing that this idea that meritocracy and that your success or your failure or your wealth or your inequality, it is about something to do with you. It's something that you have control over. And I mean, Ulrich Beck, who he had an office when I worked at the London School of Economics. Ulrich Beck had an office sort of further down the corridor. He didn't obviously work in it because he was only there sort of 0.2 of the year or something. But he wrote, that somehow we are the biographers of our own stories. Well, again, that's not true, because we've got the big concepts around class, around gender, around race. And, we are not the authors of our own biographies. So to sort of collapse that and sort of almost not see it. I mean, for those of us that study class, that's part of, I suppose, the neoliberal argument, the individualist argument that we're always sort of pushing against. It's very, very difficult to talk about class, especially if you are in a space where working class people are not naturally sort of shaped or in. It's very difficult for those of us to talk about class in ways that meritocracy is not, it's not a truth. It's not, for me, it's a fantasy. And it's very difficult to talk to other people about that, because what I'm saying to you is, perhaps your success, perhaps your academic qualifications, perhaps your, route into university or route into wherever it is, perhaps it's not on merit.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps my route has been more difficult, and perhaps I'm actually the one that should be there, and perhaps you're not. If all things were equal. And so that's a really difficult conversation to have.
Yes.
And obviously that means that talking about class is very unpopular, particularly in university settings.
I think that's helpful. And I think that Bourdieu is a useful figure. I mean, there's been a lot of recent research that I've been looking at about how to square Bourdieuist understandings of class with Marxist understandings of class, because there's a pretty big difference there. And one of the things we find in Marxist studies of class is that class is relational, and class is one's relationship to the mode of production. It's about one's relationship to property ownership. It's about one's relationship to abstract categories of capital accumulation and surplus value, right?
Yes.
And what that allows, in an interesting way, is a kind of non-specificity about the granularity of class power in Marxism.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so Marxism ends up with a definition of the working class, which can be overly broad.
Yeah.
Now, I say that as a Marxist, okay?
Yeah.
And what that actually also leads to, I think, is a sense in which, and I saw one of your articles that I actually do want to raise with you. I do want to discuss this with you, where you called out the young, very dynamic thinker, socialist thinker, Grace Blakely in the UK, where she was saying that, working class is defined by one's immediate occupation.
Yes.
Now, that claim is not necessarily in line with a Marxist understanding of class, but I think it could be, and it often is put forward that way.
I think so. That sort of group of youngish leftist sort of activists, writers, journalists, they are very interested in Marxism. Of course, why wouldn't they? And they do use Marx quite a lot. And this is why I critiqued that, is because I think they've used it incorrectly. And I also think that Marx, as you have already said, is very limited in a contemporary capitalism. Because if one, what the things that sort of young middle class people who are also, they're also, the system has changed. Things are very different to how they were. You can be, I mean, the idea of the precariat, that a sort of wealthy student who is living sort of week by week and earn very little money, but they could be somehow connected to the working class, but in actual fact they've got large amounts of cultural capital, social capital, symbolic capital, yet they may have little economic capital. That does not make them working class for that limited time. And so that is why this idea that that if you have to sell your labor, that makes you working class, because that's what Marx said. Those who sell their labor, they become working class. Well, actually, in a contemporary capitalism, that doesn't really work. It's not working, because and that's why I use Bourdieu, and that's why Bourdieu has become very important to lots of working class academics, actually, because what it also explains is culture. And it also explains snobbery. It also explains symbolism and symbolic violence, for example. And that which is what snobbery is, what class snobbery is. So therefore, for me, Bourdieu is the theory that I use. I don't take it and then just, what I do is I apply it to the work that I do. I apply it to the research that I do. And, it doesn't always work. But what it does, it explains power relationships between in the way that perhaps Marx today doesn't.
There's an interesting controversial essay by a late UK philosopher by the name of Mark Fisher.
I knew Mark. I spoke with Mark.
Okay, so he wrote an interesting article because in his later years, he turned to a kind of Bourdieuist understanding of class. And one of his contentions was that class is really defined primarily, like the most elemental aspect of one's class experience is their class origins. And therefore, he argued that Russell Brand, for the famous Russell Brand media personality.
Yeah, I've written about Russell Brand as
well. Yeah. Well, he said that because Russell Brand is working class from origins, that this is more significant than the fact that he's a millionaire now. And then I thought to myself that, wait a second, this represents an interesting schism, theoretically, between the Marxist view and the Bourdieuist view. Because the Bourdieuist view, where and I'll be honest, where its downsides might be, and I want your thoughts on this, are the fact that maybe it doesn't handle the politicization of class that well. Whereas you see with Marx was trying to strategically organize solidarity amongst workers. The question of their origins is kind of neither here nor there.
Yeah.
If you're running a strike or you're running a large scale protest, etc. You see the point?
Yes. Yeah.
So you see, my question is, Bourdieu helps us at this descriptive sociological level of revealing power, revealing how the way that class is covered over. He exposes all of that. He's the most read academic. People cite him more than most cited. He's cited more than Foucault.
Yes.
Fascinating, right?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. So, but the question for me is the politicization, because that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the working class liberating itself. I don't want the working class to discover itself. That's a tricky question. It's dialectical. They have to discover themselves in order to politically act.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the Marxist idea. That's a strong idea. That's a correct idea. So Marx is right about that. Does this make sense? I'm asking you to think
it makes total, because it's the thing I'm thinking about. It's the thing. So what we're doing now is we're sort of thinking that, right, okay, so what Bourdieu is doing is exposing power. What people like me do who use Bourdieu, I'm exposing how power relationships work between classes, and I'm showing how inequalities are formed. I'm also showing the levels of symbolic violence that is impacted upon working class people, even by middle class people who are empathetic and, you know, part of activism and whatever. So that is what Bourdieu does. But obviously what Bourdieu doesn't do, he doesn't move this forward in the way that Marx was doing and start to think about class consciousness and revolution and change and social change. So the two things they're doing two different things. But for me now, where we are in, I don't know, late capital. I mean, we could argue we're in late capitalism. So where we are now is in a very different place to where Marx was. Because what Marx was thinking about, he was thinking about the factory workers. He was thinking, and actually he had a very negative idea about what he would call, you know, the underclass. He, you know, he thought that they were the criminal class, that they were just unimportant. But in this sort of contemporary capitalism, the underclass, the poor, those who work sort of, you know, most people now do not work in large factories, in coal mines, in heavy industries. That's not what their work is. Their work is, you know, a number of different things, and usually quite individualized. And so where we are now, the very act of exposing power and saying to working class people, your apparent failure in society is not yours. That in itself is a political act. And equally, when I say to middle class people, your apparent success is also undeserved. You see, that in itself is the politicization of the thought process of Bourdieu. I think Marx would agree with me.
I think that's valuable. I mean, it's valuable only insofar as it has effects politically, in my view. There's value in the culture piece. But when we say culture, I think it's important to disambiguate the meaning of culture from the way that liberals and the culture war politics think about culture. What do I mean by that? I think that it's very important to build working class culture. But when I say that to socialists, they often will respond by saying, well, why would you want to do that? We want to eradicate the proletariat. There's nothing noble about being working class. And I would respond by saying that's true. The working class, especially the working poor, is experiencing immiseration. There's nothing noble or dignified. I mean, you could make an argument that there is, and that needs to be recognized. That's a separate point. But politically speaking, the task is to galvanize a type of righteous indignation about the conditions that those people are experiencing, so that they can locate the cause of those conditions through class lens, I would say. And I want to actually ask you, in your research, how does the working class and the working poor, and please tell me if you think there's a difference, how do they become politicized vis-a-vis an understanding of the world through the lens of class? Or do they not? And what happens in your research? How does it happen effectively? And is it happening today?
Okay, so yesterday, this is quite interesting. So yesterday, I had a lengthy meeting with a director who is making a film about the 1984 miners' strike. And in the 1984 miners' strike, I was 16 years old. That's when I first started work. And my dad and all my family were striking miners. So I came of age in this 1 year of solidarity. I think it's the longest sort of everyday strike that it was a year that there, has ever been. And it was a very intense battle between the state and actually the working class, because miners, they were, I don't know, they were what we would imagine, working class people to be, sort of heavy industry miners, mining communities. And yesterday when I was talking to him, he was asking me the same question. What happened in 1984? Why did that happen? Why was there a sense of sort of solidarity? Why was there a politicization? Because the fact was, in 1984, the miners knew that their fight was about class politics. They knew that. They knew that their fight was both personal, because what they were afraid of is that the mining industry was going to be axed by the Thatcher government, which it then was. We have no mines in the UK now. We have no mining. But also, and then how does that translate today? Could this be possible today? So they're asking these same questions. And I think that 1984 period, because we're now 40 years on, it is something that people are starting to ask, because we are in this time of capitalism where people are extremely insecure, extremely poor, extremely marginalized, and individualized. And so that question is really the very essence of class studies and class politics.
So you have written that the Brexit vote was a protest by the British working class over the fact of their own invisibility within the society. So I don't know. We don't need to sort of talk about what you feel about Brexit, whether it was a wise decision, whether it wasn't. I don't really care about that.
Yeah,
I care about the thesis that you said, right? Because that, to me, indicates class consciousness. The Brexit vote was a class consciousness vote.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so but what are the downsides to that? So if that's how class consciousness appears today, one can immediately see the problem with that, right? Which is that it's culture war, it's a resentment politics, it's a kind of shallow anti-elitism.
It's also fear. Yeah.
So is that the best we can ask for right now? Obviously, it's not the best. Is that what the horizon of class politics is? Trumpism, the Brexit. Is this our reality today?
Again, this is the question. This is the question of our time. These are the major questions of our time. So what, I mean, for a start with Brexit, I didn't vote. I'm an anarchist. I don't vote. I didn't vote. I'm a researcher and a working class person. So my interest was of why, how, what is going on. I knew that something was happening, because what I was doing is talking to working class people. I was going out, I was talking to working class people in the north sort of mining communities of Nottinghamshire, but also working class communities in London. And this sort of really threw everyone off, because the idea that, the only people who vote for Brexit are from the post-industrial areas was actually not correct. It was working class people in different areas all over the country. Otherwise, how would it have got through? So for me, what we do recognize, you were right, there was some sort of sense of class consciousness there, but it was anti-elitism. Those people in Westminster, they want this. They don't care about us. This is what we're gonna do. They are gonna hear us, they are gonna see us. So for those of us who are interested in proper change, proper political change, that felt somewhat hopeful, even if it came through as it was I mean, it was a negative vote. It was a negative against other things, but it did seem quite hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously what has happened since then, and this is, you know, in the US, there are similarities all over Europe. I mean, I have colleagues and I'm reading work from all over Europe. I read a paper from a Greek academic a few days ago. He calls this anti-systemic. So he's thinking through, because this is happening in Greece as well. This, where it's the far right and the right wing that are taking advantage of this sort of anti-elitism, inequality, and they're using the culture wars within this, and they're doing it very successfully.
Right.
So it's both things, isn't it? There is sort of a class consciousness rising. However, it is the right wing that are recognizing it and reacting to it.
Yeah. And then what I fear in this situation of the manipulation of elites that come into this, and you saw this perfectly with this sensational popular song, Rich Men North of Richmond in the United States, about basically a kind of working class farmer who had very little musical talents, but he created this incredibly soulful, just beautiful song about the rawness. Really, it was a lament against wage labor.
Yeah.
And the right tried to own this song. There's been lots of discussions on this, and even it's quite interesting because ideologically, this gentleman, Oliver Anthony, the songwriter, he has really, you know, not a clear understanding of how the power works and how the class system works. You know, it's clear that he hasn't really analyzed these things kind of like we have. That's fine. I don't care about that.
But he feels it.
But he feels it, exactly.
Yes. And then other working class people feel it too.
Yeah, and the left, broadly speaking, needs to find a way to channel that restless agitation, that restless feeling. Because like I said at the beginning, if Marx had this premonition, and other Marxists have too, that class is kind of illegible in capitalism, that the working class is kind of a distortion. That's what the proletariat is. They kind of distort the bourgeois reality. They mix it up. Everything that you're told, you think about how oppression, suffering works. The working class messes that up, right?
Yeah.
That's what that song was about.
Yeah.
It was kind of taking an image that you think you see in focus and making it out of focus, right? Yeah. That's what working class consciousness does. And that's actually why working class consciousness can never be fully captured by the academy.
No.
Right?
Yeah.
So how does the left, I know you are a leftist, you're an anarchist, how does the left get back in touch with that fact? That's I know I'm asking you.
If I knew this,
yeah.
If I knew this, I would be doing this right now. Because I have me, you know, me and other people like me, and now you're part of this as well. We're all saying this same thing. Why is it the right that can see this? Why is it they that can see it and they can pull these threads? Because they're pulling the threads together. Yep. And some of those threads do not belong together. Mm-hmm. The left are not doing that. And again, I suppose, you know, it's this idea. I mean, Marx said it, you know, the working class are not fully formed. Yeah. I think that the left cannot, and I think as the left, and with, you know, the left have become more liberal and less left, and the left has become more vanguardist and less grassroots, and more academic and less trade union. What has happened is that the left needs things to be fully formed in their minds before they can engage with it. I mean, the great example of this was the Black Panthers and then the Hillbillies.
Yep.
When they came together, I mean, there's a short film about that, isn't there? Where the Black Panthers meet with the Hillbillies and they find out that what they have in common is that they have homelessness, they have poverty, education is terrible for their children, and then they find out that they both are oppressed by the police. And both of them they all have this awakening and go, actually, we're not each other's enemy. Now, that's not happening. That is not happening. Because what we have got now is we're not seeing each other. We're not seeing each other's oppression. We're not seeing similarities with each other. We are connecting in many different ways. And actually, it's the right that have the handle on this. And that should terrify everyone, because it frightens me.
This is great. My reading, and I want to actually reference some of your research. You interview a lot of working class people for your essays and your research. My reading upon reading working class studies literature is that oftentimes, and here I really bend more towards American context because that's where I'm based. Oftentimes in the neoliberal era, class is depoliticized. Now, the reasons for that kind of go back to meritocracy. They go back. There's another reason, which is that most working class people do tend to see liberal capitalism as the kind of natural system. And it becomes quite hard on a day-to-day basis to politicize everyday experience of working class experience. In the neoliberal era. You gave this wonderful example of the Thatcherite 1984. And it's interesting that it happened in 1984, given the Orwell. Right. Talk about prospects for the politicization of class. Do you see, I mean, how would you diagnose the temperature of the politicization of class today? We talked about how it's expressed through these kind of culture war channels and things of that nature. But can you make a pivot to talk more about the personal, what you hear people say about their daily life and their experience?
Oh yes, I mean, this is one of the things that I suppose I have a connection to, because I didn't go to university till I was 31, so I didn't have that sort of 18 to whatever sort of trying to assimilate in the middle class. I didn't do that. When I went to university, I was a fully formed adult with my own ideas, and I used university and that education to, I suppose, understand my own life and my own community's life and people in my family's life. So that's what I've done with education. So where we are now, where I am now, I am still in work. I still live in a working class community. My family are still close to me. My friends are still close to me. I don't have a lot of sort of middle class academic friends. I don't do dinner parties. So my connection is always on a day-to-day basis. And that's why when the Brexit, when the EU vote was happening, I wrote an article. I mean, this is such a interesting sort of example. I wrote an article that was in The Guardian. I think it was about 4 days before the vote, before the EU vote. Now, according to polls and pollsters, that Remain would win, and actually Brexit wouldn't win. And I'd written something which said, actually, Brexit, we're going to get Brexit.
Before you predicted it.
Yeah, right. The thing is 2 days after the EU referendum and Brexit had won, the Financial Times, 2 editors, emailed me and said, can we come and meet you? Because we want to talk to you about how did you know this? What was your methodology? And when they came, because they told me they were sat in the Financial Times room in London, they were absolutely, they were absolutely sure that Remain was going to win. And it actually shocked them to their core. They were shocked. And actually, as most sort of middle-class liberals were. And they said to me, what was your methodology? And I said, I talked to people. What did you do? And they said, well, we polled people. And I was like, well, what people you polled and what people I spoke to obviously were not saying the same things. But it was more of a mood and a feeling. It was a mood and a feeling that working class people, and it wasn't, I mean, what happened with Brexit, and I think what happened with Trump as well, it was that working class anger, that working class emotion that pushed it over the line. It didn't do the whole thing. It just pushed it over the line. And that's all you need. On one day, on one vote, that's all you need. You need something to push it over the line. And so for me, it's about talking to people. You're taking the temperature all the time. You know, I am an ethnographer. I didn't know I was an ethnographer because this is what I was doing. And then, when I was doing my PhD, I read a book and went, oh my God, I'm an ethnographer. I didn't know that, but I am. So what I'm doing is taking the temperature all the time. You know, I am talking to people. I can hear what they're saying. And then when I go, actually, this needs to be researched properly. Then that's when I start reading the theory, because the theory and the research has to go together. You know, you have to push, because people will sometimes, they will say things, and it doesn't mean that that's taking the temperature of the whole country. But when you start pushing against that with theory, and that's where I use Bourdieu's theory, what's happening here? But not just Bourdieu's theory. I use a lot of, the making of E.P. Thompson's The Making of the Working Class is a very important book. Yes. Even though it's really just about history and not really theoretical, although it's a Marxist history.
Well, this is interesting because in the United States, there's a lot of working class studies academics that argue, and I want to get your take on this, Bourdieu's notion of habitus, okay? They argue that one of the problems of the working class experience, because of its precarity, especially in former industrial areas, the unemployment, the loss of stable jobs, the opioid incursion, et cetera, all of these create environments of a loss of habitus, which means that you don't get homogenous communities that can kind of come to see themselves interlinked and connected. You get a profound fragmentation. And I really think that's true in a lot of American contexts, unfortunately, especially when you get into rural areas. So the hinterlandization of class on the peripheries of cities, the argument would be that from a Bourdieuist point of view, those people have a very difficult time formulating working class connectivity. I think in the UK, because of the geography, it's slightly different. And because of the history, it's different. Can you speak to this? Loss of habitus.
Well, it's not really a loss of habitus, because habitus is just it's a theory and an explanation about a space, about social space, and how that social space then connects with other, in the field. So it's not really a loss of habitus. What it is, it's a recognition that that working class people are not homogenous, but they never were. And if you actually read E.P. Thompson's The Making of the Working Class, which I encourage everybody to do, you see that actually this is where we are now is not new, because the working class were not homogenous. They were people who were doing all sorts of different things and all sorts of different jobs and had all sorts of different ideas. When the Chartist movement came along, sort of the poorest of the working class hated the Chartists because they thought they were elitist and not representing them. So these are not problems that are new to us. I think we think they are, but actually where we are in late capital, I just think that this period of capitalism is just far more skilled and far more robust and resilient, that we've all got to the point where we go, I don't know what to do about this anymore. So I don't think that it's not a loss of habitus. It's just recognizing that working class people are not homogenous, but they never have been. How could, they never have been, but there was one thing that started to bring a consciousness together, and that was about oppression and power. Marx writes to that, but Bourdieu writes to that as well. And that is where the current left does not. I mean, how many now how many sort of left-wing commentators, academics, activists, how many of them actually now do proper critiques of the state?
Right.
Because that's what E.P. Thompson is doing with the making of the working class. He's having a debate around the relationship between the oppressed and the state.
Yes. That's very helpful. Lisa, this has been very interesting. I have a voice in the back of my head of a standard liberal voice, which is asking me to ask you the question about how one knows that either they or anyone qualifies as working class, because this is obviously a big thing, especially in American context, where you do see a fair amount of hybridization across middle and working class, and then you add working poor, and you add the heterogeneity across generations of a family, and an uncle is middle class, but the rest are working poor, and these some are in Section 8 housing. Like in my family, for example, I have members on welfare, and then I have working poor people, and then I have an uncle who's a professor. Right. So how does one, and it's a bit of a kind of pressure that liberals give to you, where they sort of say, oh, well, prove it.
They do.
How do you do that?
But that's class politics. That's what class politics is. The first thing we've got to do is start to come to terms with the fact that class is, for me, how we understand capitalism. It's the inequalities that happens in capitalism. So we have to now that doesn't mean that it's not intersected with race and gender and sexuality and religion, etc. It is absolutely intersected with that. But if you put class at the bottom of that list, what you then get is a bunch of sort of identity politics that are vying for, who's doing the worst and who's doing the best. Now, that's what capitalism, that's part of the game, as Bourdieu would say. It's the game. So if we don't use class, and we don't talk about class, and we don't fight for class politics, class theory, and class study, then obviously what we're doing is just sort of engaging in capitalism. That's what we're doing. And for me, that's why I argue intently that class theory, class politics, class thought has to be what we do first. And when we don't, we've now got identity politics, which becomes quite meaningless. That's where we are. It's meaningless. Black Lives Matter. When it comes to, directors of boards, we make sure that there's a black person on that board. But black lives who are homeless on the streets still don't matter.
Well, George Floyd was in Marx's class terms, and I always say this, he was a lumpen proletariat.
Yes, he was lumpen. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So.
But working class people are.
But the Black Panthers formulated their whole philosophy around the centrality of organizing the lumpen proletariat.
Yes.
But the new way of thinking about class on the left, because they don't think class at all for the most part, didn't say anything about George Floyd's class relation at all. They didn't. It's a big problem. But I will say Black Lives Matter, when it first started, was an anti-austerity movement in a hinterland of St. Louis, which was predominantly working class Black people, and it was very radical. It combined it very, very well, but it did get co-opted, and I think this notion that the left has that, well, if you have the right ideas, you'll never be co-opted, is not true. It's not true. You can get co-opted with great ideas. But I will say this also, Lisa, and I wonder if you agree. One of the strengths of class theory is that the bourgeoisie cannot co-opt class theory.
No.
How could they?
No.
How could they?
That's why it's unpopular.
That's the heart of the system, of the power. They can't co-opt.
Yeah, and it's unpopular. And that is the reason why it is unpopular. It's unpopular in the sort of bastions of sort of middle class bourgeois spaces. And academia is one of those spaces.
Well, this is why I always speak to people now, and people say, well, why do you support equality? Equity is more important. And it's an interesting question that people say. It's like, well, neoliberalism has forced us to hate equality. Neoliberalism has forced us to accept its system as the what they call TINA. There is no alternative. And this to me is crazy. I mean, we have liberals that have forgotten that liberalism started the French Revolution. They think that the French Revolution were a bunch of terrorists.
No,
the neoliberals
were academics.
Yeah, the problem is that the neoliberals are not really liberals. They're something else. They're much more conservative now.
Yeah.
So there needs to be.
That's where perhaps people like us, we need to perhaps talk and think through these terms like left, right, conservative, liberal, and actually start to rethink what these things mean and speak to them in different ways, because they're not helpful, are they? At the moment, they are not helpful. Calling yourself, what was really stark to me is I was in New York in June, at the end of June. So it's obviously the sort of Pride months. And I was in New York, and as I was walking through New York, I noticed that every single corporate, the big corporates, the banks, the financial industry, all of them were flying several flags and had all these sort of inspirational quotes, sort of, Black Lives Matter, Trans Lives Matter, and Pride. And I thought, Jesus Christ, this is horrific. This is horrific. And this is where we are today. And that's why we've got to start to rethink this. When you've got the co-option of the state and the corporate financial industry, and they're taking your stuff and they're taking your ideas around what equality is, and then they're shaping them and telling you back. Well, that's what capitalism does. Why are we not knowing? Why are we not noticing this?
Well, it's a good point. I mean, there's this sort of tragic narrative that subtends your point that you made, which is that when you historically fight capitalism and you do it adequately, the capitalist class begins to perceive you as an enemy, and you feel those effects. You feel those effects. There's such a thing as like a capital strike. They try to punish you for. We have now in this era a very ingenious co-optation set of procedures that have taken place, and that's just a fact. The challenge, I think, though, is that we do need to be careful, because although the right can speak to the discontents of the working class, they do that, as we mentioned. They swim upstream with capital historically. They always have.
Of course.
So you run into a problem which Marx had this great debate with this very famous person who was much more famous than him at the time, called Ferdinand Lassalle. You're probably familiar with Lassalle. Lassalle said that, well, the workers can partner with the aristocracy.
Yes,
and the aristocracy can give charity down to the workers. So you see, you run that risk. And that's actually why I think the left, as an idea, is important to remain in fidelity to, because an anti-capitalist left has to be firm on its principles.
But it has to be anti-capitalist.
That's true. I know.
And that's the bit that I think is missing, because it has to be anti-capitalist. It also has to have a critique of the state. And actually, The left doesn't always do that now.
Yeah.
The left doesn't, it's not always anti-capitalist, and it's not always critiquing the state.
Well, we're going through an incredible, I don't know what you think about generation theory, but I think we're going through an interesting generational transmutation, right? And it'd be interesting
Yes,
to see your thoughts on that, in the sense that there's something has withered within the millennial generation and its radicalism, apropos its support for socialism, its critique of capitalism was evident and has been evident. But then we hit, after Corbyn and Bernie Sanders and many other factors, that radicalism has hit a wall. And now we are on the cusp of the largest wealth transfer intergenerationally, from the boomers to the millennials, when they retire, when the parents retire. And it will be so fascinating to see how the class politics formulate once that wealth transfer takes place. I predict, and I wanted your thoughts on this, I predict we could have a recipe for a lot of resentment politics if the younger generations, when they receive those inheritance and so on, they don't recognize the class inequality that is a part of that transfer of wealth.
I think they already don't recognize
waiting to happen.
I think they already don't, Daniel. I think they already don't recognize it, because again, this is a big debate, this sort of generational thing, the boomer versus the millennial. Well, actually, if you're working class, there's not the wealth transfer. It's not going to happen. This is what's happening. Every single political debate is centered around middle class people, and actually the working class are not even in it. So they're not even there going, actually, this is not going to be me. This is not going to be me. My dad still lives. My dad lives in social housing. He lives in the same council house that I grew up in. There's going to be no wealth transfer. He was a miner. He was made redundant when the pits closed, when the mines closed. He's never worked again. There's no wealth
40 years
transfer.
ago. Right.
Yeah, he's never worked again, because when you've got millions of men unemployed in small concentrated areas, and then the government does nothing about that, then what happens? There's no work. So therefore, these are how these sort of deindustrializations have sort of fell in. This is what's happened, and it's not just here in the UK. The UK is a great example of it. It's sort of an idea. It's one of Weber's ideal types, actually, because it happened so perfectly. But actually, it's happening all over Europe. It's happening in the US. It's happening in many different places that has had sort of heavy industries. This is this donutting falling in the middle. This is already happening. So when we're talking about this sort of wealth transfer and the generation, and we've got a generation of boomers who have got paid off mortgages, great pensions, etc., etc., we are only talking about some of the population. We're not talking about that probably 10% at the top. Because I don't go for the 1% thing. I think that's bad politics. 1% is bad, and the rest of us are, all the same.
I think this is helpful. I worry, and maybe we're already at this point, but I worry that the working class experience is so tokenized in a middle class media environment. Because there was a study of the UK media professionals in the last, 20, 30 years, I think, or more, maybe last 10 years. I think you probably saw this. Got a lot of publicity. Only 7 to 11% were people from working class backgrounds.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's not just academia, really. It's the whole professional public relations industry.
Yes.
And this is actually why the professional managerial class some people in the United States have tried to politicize this, right? To say that actually left-wing politics, socialist politics, needs to be about politicizing the ideology of this class, precisely because it is so middle-class oriented.
Yes.
And when you are working class within that milieu, you're treated as just another kind of sort of sub-marginalized identity group. The problem with that is that those sub-marginalized identity groups, as you mentioned, already encompass the broader working class, and by sheer numbers, we far outnumber them in some sense, right?
Yes.
So how do we shift? This is a question of social reality and ideology in power.
And it's also about it's about representation as well.
Well, that's true. It's about representation, but here's the problem. Okay, I just want to push on this. There's a problem with that, though. We don't want to accept a tokenization on the terms of the middle class discourse, do we? I would say no.
No.
Representation on whose terms? That's my always problem with representation. You can be represented at Harvard as like the 5% of working class people. So what? That actually might do more harm because you're justifying the system. If you're one in 5,000 from your little impoverished area, that's actually more harmful.
Yeah.
Than
and that's what we were saying about the co-option. That's where you get the co-option, because you get corporates, you get politics, you get the media industries, the culture industries, etc. And what they do is they'll say, well, we'll have one of those, and one of those, and then we're done. But when I'm talking about representation, I'm talking about class politics and representation. I'm not talking about me there. I'm talking about the ideas being represented. Now, those ideas are not they're not represented.
That's helpful. That's helpful.
Yeah, so you have, we'll have one of these, and one of those.
So what you're saying is, okay, fine. We live in this middle class world. We're dominated, working class people. You could call it an ethical mission. They need to not sell out, and they need to not forget, and they need to. Why not? Right? There's a beauty.
Why can't we say that? Is that not? It's not radical, is it?
Well, no. The problem is that everybody sells out, or they tend to, right?
Yeah.
It's very difficult to go into arenas and talk about these things.
Yes.
Because you become tokenized, and then you feel like you're an imposter, and that whole thing. So it's a question of building the fortitude and the courage amongst working class people to never stop pushing on this. Maybe that's one way to think about it.
Yeah, but that's also, again, that's why grassroots and this is one of the things that I have massive debates with. The grassroots hard work at the bottom is essential. It has to be done. Now, but it's not being done, and it hasn't been done for 20, 30 years. Because the trade unions have lost power, the trade unions have sort of moved into, I don't know, some sort of bureaucratic sort of associations. So this grassroots work, right at the bottom, that's hard work, that's going out and talking and being in the same room, and to some extent getting off Twitter and doing this sort of thing. Because Twitter, that is unhelpful. It's the most unhelpful thing there is. But most people's activism is on Twitter. So what we've got, this is the hard work. Now, it's difficult. This is difficult to do. And this is why I keep coming back to the E.P. Thompson's The Making of the Working Class. Because if you read that, it's 300 years of bloody hard work. It's people arguing with each other in rooms, having physical fights with each other, having to deal with each other's different views and different ideas. This is why this didn't happen. So this idea that somehow this is a new time and it's all different. It's not all different.
Yeah.
But it's hard work.
There's a great Marxist philosopher who said that when the Soviet Union disintegrated, it is the equivalent of turning the workers' movement back to ground zero, to the beginning.
Yeah.
We start over again.
Yeah, and that might be where we are actually. Yeah. We might be in, and can we consider that as people that want these changes to be made? Should we just consider? And anarchist friends who are my age. You know, they're not the young idealist anarchists, they're the old, sort of weathered, cynical anarchists. And that's what they think. They think that actually this is what we've got to do, is take what we've got at the moment. And if there is sort of disruption and sort of pushing against the state in certain ways, we need to be there and doing that. So does that mean that even if we don't always agree with the things that's happening, you know, should we still be there? Because we are at ground zero. This is where we are. We're not in, you know, it's not after 1945 where there's some sort of consensus happening. That's not where we are. There is no consensus. There is no consensus. So perhaps that's where we are, and that's what we have to do. But that is a very difficult conversation to have, because that means that you've got to get off your high horse. That's something that we say here. You've got to get off your high horse, and you've got to talk to people that actually perhaps, you know, you don't agree with, and perhaps there is going to be arguments made, but our plight is of such a great, you know, that's where we are. And so perhaps, you know, I've got a saying: you've got to stop wishing where you want to be and actually be real about where you are.
That's very wise. Yes. No, Lisa, this has been so nice to chat with you. Are you in kind of, in conclusion, wanted to get a feel for what you're working on now? You did your dissertation on this big study, and then you're constantly writing articles, and you're really much like very much a public sort of figure. That's going to continue. Are you working on a book? What's next?
I'm working on loads of stuff. I'm always working on loads of stuff. I mean, one of the great shames about academia, and this is the great shame, you know, I wish I'd been an academic 50 years ago, because they just seem to have freedom to write. The greatest shame about academia now is that research has to be done quickly. It has to be published in specific places, or otherwise it doesn't count. And that's and it takes years to get this stuff published. And actually what we need to be doing is doing stuff now. So that's why I do lots of writing, write lots of articles. I do lots of stuff like this, because these are the conversations. Today is a new conversation, making me think about new things, pushing us into places that we've got to think about. So what am I doing now? Well, there's a book that is half written about gentrification in London, because obviously gentrification is a class issue. Then there is a book which is going to be about the British class system, that will be a few years in the making. But I'm currently writing 8 short stories about the miners' strike in 1984. Again, because it's really important that we think about that year of 1984. We start to think about what happened in that year here in the UK, the politics that was there, Thatcherism, Reaganism. It was a beginning of something. It wasn't an end of anything. It was a beginning of something. And actually 40 years, and we're out next year will be 40 years. And so therefore writing short fictional fact stories about that year, and then thinking through the politics of where are we today? And I know there are lots of similarities. We've got lots in common, because, one of the things that happened in our de-industrialized communities is they were left to rot for a good sort of 15, 20 years. And then what happens is they're ripe to be exploited again.
Oh, yeah.
And then what came was the Amazon warehouses.
Right.
Lo and behold, the Amazon warehouse came, and that's where we need cheap, accessible labor, unskilled, that we can mess about. Cheap land, because obviously the cities are expensive land. The cheap land is where the industrial places used to be. So, and guess what? That's where the most desperate people are too. What a coincidence. So that that started to happen in the 1980s, isn't it? In the very early 1980s. So for me, writing those short stories that are very narrative, they're very, they're about working class life in 1984. It might help us to figure out why we are where we are.
Yeah, because it seems like it was at a sort of peak of a certain type of politicization, maybe militancy that we've lost touch with. So that
not just militancy. I mean, also let's think about things like what else happened. The financialization of everything started to happen then. Housing. People started to think about housing as assets or pensions or not
human capital.
Not things that that you'd got to live in order to be safe. And so, and I think in the early 1980s we probably thought there was an end of something.
Because
it was an end of
in Marxist theory, one idea that Marx has is that you have this thing called labor power. And so at that time, 1984, the miners still had a certain labor power that was at their fingertips. They could leverage, they could negotiate. Financial capitalism has a kind of acephalic form of power, right? It's not as centralized as it was.
No.
And so it becomes a puzzle, right? This is why we have these conversations, to sort of help people piece together a puzzle. And I think, frankly, one of the benefits of talking to you today has been this idea that you are a kind of example that others can follow in how to have fidelity to what you believe in. Because I think that I interviewed this other interesting author who wrote a book called The Melancholia of Class, named Cynthia Cruz. It's a memoir and also a kind of manifesto about working class experience.
I have read that. Yeah.
It's interesting because we talked a lot about how she got a lot of comments from people like, thank you so much for expressing this. I never found it expressed so palpable and so raw, but it's my life too. And it's interesting, the question of shame and the secretiveness. Like in my family, I talk about class all the time, and you know what I hear is like, gosh, he is so intense. We agree with him, but it's like, let's keep it quiet.
Yeah. See, I don't get that.
Do you encounter that? Because this is a very American thing. It's a very, I think Protestantism is a big culprit.
No, I don't. Do you know why I don't get that?
Why do you not get that?
Because I was brought up in a mining community.
Right.
And there was only us. There was no one else. There was no one else. So what I was brought up in a community that said to me, we are working class. We are proud people. We might not be the wealthiest people, but we keep the lights on. So we knew we were central. So you know what? And actually, it was more homogenous then. We did live it. I lived, I don't know if it's the same as the coal camps in the US.
Yeah.
They're quite isolated because what happened is a mine was dug and then people had to live around it. Yeah. So it didn't organically happen like a city where you live near a river or whatever. And so therefore, I was brought up really believing that being working class was the best thing. And I've always thought, I still think that now.
But you do recognize that attitude is kind of rare these days.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
It is. Unfortunately, it is rare. It's a question of how to, and here I think art, movies, those things do matter there.
Yeah.
Because it kind of builds a sort of.
But again, isn't that about representation again? Who gets to tell the story?
Sure. Although I am cautious of that word, but I think
yes.
in this
way, it's about who who tells the story and from whose lens.
Yeah, it does matter. It does
It
matter.
really does matter, and over my lifetime, that's one of the things. I can sit down. There's a film called Pride, and it's about the miners' strike in 1984. And I sit there and just laugh at it. It's like the film Love Actually and Five Weddings and a Funeral and that sort of fake British, oh, we all really like each other really thing. It's like that of the miners' strike. And and I can sit and watch that and think, I know why you've told this story. I know why it's happened. But it's just so sanitized. And working class stories, as you have said,
Mm.
and as you know, are difficult. And why would you want to be working class when it's so difficult? Because that's all it's represent. It's represent. You're either a hero or a villain. That's it. But for me, I know it in all its complexity, and I know that but one thing I do know about being working class is more we talk about it, it shouldn't be something that we should be ashamed of.
Well, the problem also is in the United States, we had the Bernie Sanders phenomenon. Now, I'm not saying I'm very upset with him for various reasons I won't get into, but here's what happened, and I'm sure you know this.
I've just read his book.
Okay, well, listen. So what happened was all that kind of passive, underneath the surface feelings. He raised it up, right? And people started to test power with his message. And we were put in our place. He was put in his place
Yes.
very swiftly, very harshly. That has created a reverberation downward of a depoliticization and a fear that do not try that again. Don't try that
Yeah.
again. And that's come from the left, so-called, the liberals. That's what they did to
Yeah.
us. So we face this reality too. It just adds to the challenge of the prospect of like, well, can we take class and make it work politically? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, but that's the thing. That's what we've got to do. We've got to talk about class, and it's got to be class politics. It can't be class. It can't be just talking about class, oh, I'm working class. Are you working class? What makes you working? It's not that. It's about the politics of that. It's about, and that is ultimately the politics of anti-capitalism.
Absolutely. Yes.
So so for me, it's just really obvious.
And also telling people that, being honest, that we are going to get beat. They are going to treat us badly in political arenas, but like, don't let that stop you.
No.
And that to me, because then people will say, oh, well, I would rather, if I'm going to be political, I'll just be liberally political with the NGOs and the nonprofits and the whatever, that whole
Yeah,
thing,
which is not political.
which is not political. So yeah,
But
we
again,
need
why
these.
can't we say this?
Well, we have to say it.
It's
We have
not
to.
political. Charity is not
Well, we
politics.
need new leadership. Frankly, we need new leadership to sprout from the younger generations that have weathered these defeats. And people need to stand up and say, yeah, get up, stand up and do it. And do it. And you're gonna get pushback. So what? Like, people are afraid of losing. They're afraid of how they're going to appear. The censorious social media thing harms that prospect because people don't want to be perceived in any certain way. So we need leadership that will allow for people to be courageous on these issues. I think that's a big part of this.
You see, I don't know. Obviously I'm an anarchist, so I'm not really a big of leadership. So, but where I am with this is, we know that the media, politics, all the cultural industries, because again, it's that question: who is entitled to do interesting work? Well, it's not working class people. So they're not. So all those spaces where power is, whether you're a Marxist or a Bourdieusian, whether it's the base and the superstructure, or whether it's the capital, that's where the power is. We know where it is. We all know that. But we can't be in there. And then that power has co-opted the idea of representation and diversity. So therefore, we know when we go in, we're like, it's a red herring. Because you can go, because the thing is with me, what happened with me is they let me in. And then they went, shit, she's actually working class. God, we better get rid of her. So
No, wait. Okay, hold on. I'd say one thing here. I actually think there's a lot of people who get in from working class backgrounds and they disassociate. You know, they try to pretend that there's that whole thing.
yes, yeah, they're not assimilated. So
You refuse to assimilate. That's the
it's not
difference.
that I refuse, I can't do it. And
Yeah.
I just say, and you know what? There's some of us that can't. Some of us can, you know, I think I didn't go to university as that 18-year-old. So so I can't assimilate. It's not that, do you know what? You know, if I could, I bloody would, because I could earn decent money and be a, you know, and actually have an easy life. I cannot assimilate. I can't, because this is who I am. I can't do anything else about that. So I may as well just go with it. So for me, what do we do when these spaces allow us in, but only under certain conditions?
Mm.
And then we can't or we won't meet those conditions.
Mm.
So for me, then it's about setting up alternative spaces.
Mm.
And that's obviously the anarchist bit in me,
Yeah.
because I then start to think, well, if I went to work for The Guardian. So I mean, this is an interesting story. So when I finished this book, Getting By, and it was a sensation. People were like, "Oh my God, how is this voice, this authentic voice coming out?" And The Guardian asked me if I would write a column for them about class in Britain. And I was supposed to go in and have a
On
meeting
a
with them.
regular basis. Yeah, kind of regular columnist. Yeah.
Yes, so I would have had I'd have been a columnist,
So they
you
give
know,
you a
and
little salary. They give you a salary.
yes, and it, you know, it would have been great, and I would have talked about class.
Mm-hmm.
And I was supposed to go in on the Monday morning to go and have this meeting with them about this. On the Saturday, I was part of this demonstration, this anti-gentrification demonstration in a part of East London that's being gentrified. And there was something called the Serial Killer Cafe, which was like this hipster joint that was selling cereal, American cereal actually, at like £9 a bowl. And it had taken over from a working class shop. So, you know, we got to it and we threw red paint on the windows and put cereal on it. And immediately the people who own that hipster joint had got PR people, and it was all over the news. It was everywhere. The Guardian saw me on the footage, cancelled the appointment immediately. Because what they wanted is they wanted a working class person who didn't do stuff like that.
Mm.
You know, who didn't go, actually gentrification is a class issue, because, you know, that it's a corporate. And so we get in or we don't get in,
Mm.
but perhaps we have to set new things up. That's the hard work, isn't it? That's the
Yeah,
hard
well,
work.
I'm sure many of my listeners will have skepticism towards anarchism, but after you shared that,
I've got skepticism
but
towards.
after you shared that story, I think everyone will have more respect for you. That's a very interesting story. That's fascinating. Yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah,
listen,
my life has been filled with it.
I want to thank you for coming on. This has been really spirited and at times quite inspirational for me, and hopefully it will
And
be
me.
for everyone else. It's been great to chat with you. I hope we can stay in touch. And this was great. So let's keep on going, keep on doing what you're doing, please.
Yeah, yeah, and you too. Thank you. Every conversation I get like this adds something, and I walk away thinking new things.
Beautiful. Thanks again, Lisa. We'll talk soon.
Yeah, thank you, Dan.